The dusty frontier town of Ironwood was no stranger to cruelty. But that day, the cruelty took on a face that made the air heavy. At the edge of the marketplace, a shackled Comanche woman stood with her wrists bound, her proud dark eyes dulled by humiliation. She was tall, fierce-looking, but thin from hunger, her long braids undone, her torn deerskin dress clinging to her frame. The trader barked out her price like she was cattle. $1 for the savage! Who'll take her? Men laughed. Some spat at the ground. Some muttered about using her for labor or worse. Nobody offered even a coin, and she stood silent, her lips pressed together in defiance. Then, from the back of the crowd, stepped Samuel Grayson, a rancher known for his solitude. He was a widower in his 40s, his beard graying, his eyes shadowed by years of loneliness under the wide Texas sky. He didn't come looking for trouble, but as his gaze fell on her, something pulled at his chest, something he couldn't explain. The trader smirked at him. "What'll it be, rancher?" "She ain't worth much." "But you'll get your dollar's worth." Samuel's jaw clenched. He hated the cruelty of the words, but he pulled a worn dollar from his coat and slapped it into the trader's hand. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Samuel didn't care. He stepped forward, unfastened her bonds gently, and whispered, "You're free now. As free as I can give you." She didn't move, didn't speak. But when he placed his coat over her shoulders, she looked at him with eyes that carried centuries of grief, and something else, something unbroken. The wagon ride to the ranch was heavy with silence. Samuel guided the horses while the Comanche woman sat beside him, wrapped in his coat, her head lowered but her eyes restless, taking in the open prairie. He tried to speak once, asking if she had a name, but she gave no answer. He didn't press her. When they arrived at his small ranch, a lonely stretch of land with a weathered cabin and corral, Samuel helped her down, though she pulled away from his touch with sharp pride. He pointed to the cabin. "It ain't much, but it'll keep the wind off." She followed him inside, her steps quiet, her presence filling the space in a way that unsettled him. He fixed her a plate of beans and bread. She hesitated before eating, suspicion flickering in her eyes. But when she tasted the food, hunger overcame her hesitation. Samuel sat across the table, studying her carefully. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. "You're not a slave here. You're free to stay until you choose otherwise." She glanced up at him then, her dark eyes unreadable, and for a moment, he thought she might speak. But instead she looked away, her silence thicker than words. That night he gave her his bed and slept by the fire, staring into the flames. He told himself he had only saved her because no one else would, that it was pity alone. But in the quiet of his heart, he knew there was something deeper stirring. Something dangerous, a yearning for connection, for warmth, for a soul that might break. Through the iron solitude he carried, the days stretched long and strange. She worked without being asked, hauling water, mending clothes, sweeping the cabin with silent precision. Samuel noticed the strength in her arms, the grace in her steps, the way she carried herself like a warrior even in the simplest of tasks. He found himself stealing glances, though he told himself not to, ashamed of the hunger inside him. One evening, after tending the cattle, he returned to find her sitting by the fire, her long hair unbound, her face softened by the glow. She looked up at him, and something in her eyes made his breath falter, a softness mixed with sorrow, a silent offering of trust. Without a word she rose, stepped close, and placed his own coat back over his shoulders, her fingers brushing against his chest. Samuel froze, every instinct screaming to pull away, to preserve the distance he swore to keep. But then she lifted her hand to her collarbone, pressed it to her chest, and slowly, with no sound, let her dress fall from one shoulder. It was not lust he saw, it was surrender, a wordless plea for safety, for belonging, for comfort. His heart thundered as he reached up, gently lifting the fabric back over her shoulder, his rough hands trembling. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not like this. You're not something to be given, not something to be taken. You're a woman, not a slave. You're safe here." Her lips parted as though to speak, but instead tears filled her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. In that moment she didn't offer again, but she leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. And Samuel held her, just held her, as though the world outside no longer mattered. It was in the silence of that embrace that everything changed. From then on their bond deepened, not through words, but through the small acts of kindness that filled each day. She began to hum softly while she worked, low melodies of her people, sounds that carried across the prairie like prayers. Samuel listened in awe, the lonely ache in his chest easing for the first time in years. Slowly, she began to trust him enough to share her voice, her name. "Ahyoka," she whispered one dawn as they stood watching the sunrise. He repeated it, the foreign syllables rough on his tongue but tender in his tone, and she smiled faintly, the first true smile he had ever seen on her lips. Their nights grew warmer, not of the body alone but of the soul, sitting by the fire, sharing stories with gestures, her eyes lighting with pride as she described her homeland. Samuel began to see her not as someone he had saved, but as someone who had saved him. She was not the silence that haunted him. She was the voice he had longed to hear, and though the town whispered cruelly about the rancher who brought home a Comanche woman, Samuel stood tall, his hand steady on hers. She had once offered her body in silence, but he had offered her something greater in return: respect, choice, a place to belong. And as the prairie wind sang through the open fields, they both knew that what had begun with a single dollar had grown into something no money could ever buy: love, fierce and unbreakable, born of silence but destined to echo forever. And that, friends, is the story of how a lonely rancher bought a woman the world saw as a slave, but instead of chains, he gave her freedom, dignity, and love. If this tale moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful Wild West stories of redemption, courage, and unexpected romance.